token of love. London's Foundling Hospital is located in Coram's Fields, near Bloomsbury. It's now a beautiful museum that also advertises itself as a luxury events venue, and whose profits are still dedicated to the care of poor children. It was founded in the 18th century to house orphans and abandoned or deserted young children. Some children were sent there when their parents died. Other parents used the hospital to give their children up for adoption. Some parents could not afford to feed their sons and daughters because of a crisis of debt or poverty, and so they would take them to the hospital in the hope of a better future, or at least a future that avoided starvation. And some of this last group of parents even believed that this better future might include a change in their own circumstances, so that they would be able to return to reclaim their lost family. So that a parent could reclaim their child if circumstances made it possible, they were asked to affix on each child some particular writing or other distinguishing mark or token, so that the children may be known thereafter if necessary. These tokens, which are of love and vain hope and loss and abandonment, were then filed away, so that they could be described and identified by anyone who later claimed to be the parent of a particular foundling child. They were sometimes poor scraps of cloth, or beaten out pennies, or carved buttons, or pieces of paste jewellery, and some 18,000 of them, representing 18,000 stories of individual loneliness and the loss of family, are now on display in the museum's archive room. One token in particular catches the attention: a beaten out penny, cut and then shaped to look like a heart, with the initials EB, the name given to a foundling child, stamped into it. To be orphaned is to become alone in the world, even in the midst of the noisy and very obviously crowded Foundling Hospital. The way John's Gospel uses the image of orphanhood in today's recommended reading conveys the potential despair and loss of a guiding influence in the lives of the disciples, which Jesus' death seemed to threaten. It allows us to imagine the effect that Jesus' walk to the cross had on them. It brought them a sense of utter abandonment and the destruction of all their hopes. Yet John tells how Jesus' words on his last evening with his followers and friends were still able to hint at the eventual transformation of that symbol of loss into an image of the returning faithfulness of God, who is an abiding love. The founding token I mentioned earlier is a sign of that grace kind of loss, and yet it is in the form of a heart, a symbol of love that we can all recognise. And it was left with the tiny yet longing hope of eventual reunion. The cross is a symbol of torture and pain and death, the cruelest kind of death which the Roman Empire, who specialised in devising cruel deaths, could imagine. And yet the cross now seems to be also a sign of God's power to redeem those horrors through his own faithfulness. The coming of the Holy Spirit is spoken of in John's Gospel as a pledge and as a way of learning more deeply of this love of God, which the disciples had first really known in Jesus' love, and which Jesus says will never break with them when tested by painful circumstances, or in the confrontation with evil, poverty, sickness, hatred, and even death. The battle between God's love and those cruelties is something that he promises will be continued. The Holy Spirit is God that comes alongside the disciples again, after Jesus' death, so that in the Holy Spirit they can receive Jesus and their knowledge of him again and anew. This is the revelation of God as a Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it is the revelation of the Trinity as fully united in all substance and will. And the experience of that renewal by the approach of the Holy Spirit brings the disciples, and we who are now disciples, to the point where Christians first become tokens of the same form of love which they have been granted by the Father and experienced in the presence of Jesus. It is because of the returning hope of the Holy Spirit that, after the crucifixion, Christians are able to come alongside those who rejoice and rejoice with them, also to stand with those who weep and weep with them. Bernard of Clairvaux's understanding of the way that humans respond to God's love, through God's love, places this sort of selfless solidarity with others as the highest form of human existence. He says that a completely generous way of loving is a seeking after the things which are of Christ. He writes that the way humans might learn to love God is as a response to contemplating God's own love for us, and that the everlasting reward humans receive for loving God is a gift of his own love. This might seem like a rather circular way of talking, but it is hardly more so than Jesus' promise that eventually the disciples will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you, which is a phrase that I've always found reminiscent of the lyrics of I Am the Walrus by the Beatles. Our human experience of the Trinity is circular, because of the complete unity of the Trinity, and because Christians are embedded within the love of the Trinity, which comes alongside us now and again through the Holy Spirit. Jesus' promise to his disciples that the Holy Spirit would abide with them after his crucifixion carries an echo of the story of the book of Exodus, in which the Father pitched his tent among the Jewish people in order to rescue them from slavery and to camp with them each night as they journeyed to freedom. The promise Jesus made to his disciples on his last night with them was to somehow return, being received by them again in the Holy Spirit, to continue to rescue them in love from their abandonment. For this is God's love, not that we were faithful in loving him, but that he reclaims us and is shaping us into a symbol of his abiding love. You can find this